The dark night carried the storm closer to the small home, but it still lurked far off into the distance. The rumbling of the thunder was unaccompanied by lightning or even moonlight, making the night all the more dark in nature. The rain had yet to come, but there was a slight, rhythmic tapping on the young girl's window. Hannah, the young girl, peeked her head out from beneath the covers and glanced at the dark window, to see nothing within its frame. She glanced at her pink nightlight briefly, before covering her head beneath the thick covers of safety. Nighttime was especially dark for poor Hannah, especially since the incident between her parents' shouting match a couple of nights ago. She didn't understand how or why, but she was now staying with her mother at Grandpa's cabin out in the woods, without Daddy. The cabin and the surrounding woods were all new to her. She enjoyed the colorful forest during the day, but nighttime yielded shadows and sounds that awakened the most terrifying of dreams. Thankfully for young Hannah, she had made a friend. An old secret friend. A friend that would come by every evening and calm her by singing lovely lullabies that were both unfamiliar and calming. The tapping returned, and again Hannah found the strength to glance at the window to see an old and withered hand softly tapping the window with a long fingernail. Hannah smiled briefly as the window frame was now filled with a hooded figure. The only thing that Hannah could see under the hood was a long warty nose and brown teeth that were scattered across the gummy smile of an old woman. The woman began to sing songs of dark dreams and distant horrors that were yet to arrive, but as for now, she was safe. Little did Hannah know safe would be a relative word, a word that would only exist for the time being as long as she kept the window closed. The old woman, after singing a dark tune or two, beckoned young Hannah to unlock the window.
"You don't even need to open it, dear. Just unlock it. I can do the rest."
Hannah, despite being young and naive, knew better. Her father had taught her the concept of stranger danger. She was never allowed to open the front door for anyone that she didn't know, but he never did say anything about the window. The old woman began to get desperate and offered Hannah a small velvety bag with a surprise inside. The old woman reached into the bag and pulled out what looked like a strange white stone with random edges.
"I have many of these inside this bag, and they can all be yours. Just unlock your window. I just want to come and say hello to Mommy. I'm one of her friends."
Hannah's young ignorance had met its match. This old woman was Mommy's friend, or so she thought. She wasn't a stranger anymore. It would be rude to keep Mommy's friend outside waiting in the dark storm. Hannah got up and slowly pushed the dresser under the window and climbed up and unlocked the window. Hannah quickly raced back to her bed and hid under the covers. "That's a good girl," the old woman hissed as the window slowly slid open. Hannah's breathing began to overwhelm her as she hid under the covers. The old woman climbed in the window, placed the velvety bag on her dresser, and crawled over to her door and tried to open it. The door was locked from the outside.
"Mommy doesn't want us to leave,"
Hannah squeaked from beneath the covers.
"Don't worry, dear. I'm going to say hi, and I'll be right back."
The old woman then began to slam her frail body against the door repeatedly. Not long after, they heard footsteps walking over to the door outside. The frame of the door began to splinter as they both heard a scream coming from Mommy. The door finally gave way and bursted open. Hannah began to quickly cry as she heard Mommy not greeting her friend from the woods, but rather screaming in terror as things began to crash on the floor. The screams continued for a time as a loud banging could be heard coming from the other room and vibrate across the floor. The screaming eventually dwindled, but the banging continued. Well, the screaming from Mommy at least. Mommy's friend, who Hannah soon realized was not her friend, could be heard grunting as if she was doing something laborious as the banging continued. The banging eventually stopped, and to Hannah's horror, the old woman came crawling back to her room and next to her bed.
"I got you more stones for your collection,"
the old woman said as she placed the white objects that were still wet with the dark liquid into the bag. The woman then sat next to her bed and told her another tale of some wretched disease that would infect the living and cause them to rot, and a lullaby, of course. She then crawled over to the dresser and climbed up and out the window. Hannah slowly drifted off into sleep, but the sleep didn't last long. She was awakened not much later to strange men with guns coming into the cabin, and eventually her room. They all had badges much like the police, but they didn't dress like the police. Hannah's father were with these men and hugged her when he saw that she was still chained to her bed and unharmed. Mommy was nowhere to be seen. You would think that Mommy and Daddy would want to be together, but they weren't. In fact, Hannah would not see Mommy ever again. Hannah, being so excited to finally see her father after so long, gave him a gift. The same gift that the old woman gave her. He opened the velvet bag and began to cry. Apparently, he had to give the bag to the police since some of the white stones belonged to Mommy. Hannah had to tell the police about the friend that came and helped her get found by the police. Without her, she would still be out in the woods without Daddy, they said. I guess in a bizarre way, that strange woman was in fact a friend, after all. There's been a lot of discussion surrounding the mysterious footage of the so-called Nightcrawler. I grew up in Fresno, California, and for many years had no handle on a terrifying teenage experience that haunts me to this day. It began in 1993 when 3 friends and I decided to spend an autumn night in the woods near Millerton Lake. It was the perfect conclusion to an amazing summer and something we'd been planning for so long, but always found a way to put off. We walked aimlessly by the lake for hours, skipping stones, fishing, and enjoying the warmth of the quickly fading sunlight. The warmth soon disappeared behind the treetops, and we decided to walk a little further into the undergrowth to find a good spot to set up camp for the night. Alex and I set up the tent while Terrence began collecting wood for a campfire. We had beer, meat, and all the necessary components for a long night's supply of s'mores. The cold autumn night soon enveloped our campsite, and crickets began to sing as the smoky scent of the steak that we were cooking drifted through the trees and up into the clear night sky. As we finished off the last of the beer, we noticed that we had slightly underestimated the amount of wood needed to keep a fire going, and so I decided to hunt around for some dry logs and branches. I paced around the campsite, but I couldn't find anything more substantial than a couple of twigs, so I decided to grab a flashlight and leave the safety of our enclosure out into the wall of darkness surrounding us. It became clear that this forest had experienced a dry run of fire-building materials, because for the life of me, I could not find anything big enough to justify carrying it back to camp. I didn't think I had wandered far when I heard a rush of air behind me. I turned around and saw the leaves of the forest floor twirling in the beam of my flashlight. A small dust devil, perhaps. But as I fixed my gaze ahead of me and back towards the campsite, I noticed that things were not quite right. I hadn't walked more than 200 meters, and yet I couldn't see any glow of a fire whatsoever. I began to feel incredibly uneasy at the implication that I had somehow wandered further from the campsite than imagined, and was now lost in this ominous woods, alone. I managed to collect myself and began retracing my steps. The sameness of every direction was disconcerting. However, I could see impressions in the dirt of where I had previously walked, so I followed, intently, knowing that I would soon see the glowing orange light of the fire and the welcoming silhouettes of my friends by a tent. The more I walked, the more I began to feel that things were not right. I was still following the trail of my footsteps, and yet somehow, after 5 minutes of walking, I was no closer to the campsite. I knew that I had not walked this far on my way out here. I stopped, feeling the need to crouch down and consider the situation before fear began to take hold. I looked around and began to notice that the trees around me felt strangely distant and faint, almost as if they were shrouded in a dark mist. This wasn't a physical mist, but rather something ominous that had somehow cloaked the forest in darkness. This just wasn't the darkness of night, but beyond that, you could feel it. I stood up, however, and logic prevailed as I continued along the long path of my footsteps. In the distance, I could see something familiar. I immediately picked up the pace, and as I got closer, I realized that it was the campsite, but there was no fire. The camp felt completely cold and empty. It seemed strange that the fire would have died out so quickly, but not beyond reason. I finally reached the tent, and that uneasy feeling that I had managed to suppress quickly reappeared, as I realized that my friends were no longer there. I called out their names and shined my flashlight into the surrounding foliage, but there was no response. At this point, all semblance of composure left my body. I realized that they could have simply wandered off to try to find me, but I somehow knew that this wasn't the case. Call it a sixth sense, if you will. I decided that the only thing I was to do was to try to restart the fire with whatever fuel I could find. But no matter what I did, no flame would appear from my Zippo, as if it too wanted to hide away from this overwhelming darkness. I sat down again, with my head in my hands, racking my brain for an explanation of the events so far. I began to feel the surrounding blackness scurry closer towards me, as if it knew that somehow the absence of fire had removed some protective force field from around the camp. The next thing I can recall is just being confronted by the most terrifying sound. It can only be described as an eerie whirring noise, almost like a tornado siren, but completely unnatural and unlike anything I'd ever heard. Chills ran down my spine as I sat up to determine the source of this haunting sound. It seemed to reverberate through the tree trunks in all directions, as the breeze, which had been ever present throughout the evening, seemed to retreat almost instantly into silence. I heard footsteps and immediately rejoiced that my friends were returning to camp, and that we would discuss the night's events and, at long last, put myself at ease. As I listened to these footsteps drawing closer, I felt a sudden uneasiness as I realized that there was something very wrong with the sound. They were far too slow. It sounded as if someone were to be walking unnaturally leisurely, artificially, or alternatively, that they were on stilts. The more I listened to these footsteps, the more convinced I became that this was the sound of someone walking on stilts, and that this thought really scared me, because after all, who or what would be walking on stilts in this pitch blackness in the thick of the forest? I shined my flashlight in the direction of the sound, dreading what I might see, but I had to know. The footsteps were closer than ever now. They must be right here, I thought. Suddenly I see an object glint in the beam of my light. The footsteps stop. At this point I am absolutely frozen in terror as I glimpse a small white object through the trees. It moves slightly and I see what looks like a head and legs. The head slowly turns towards me and what I see causes me to scream, but no sound comes from my mouth. The head is completely featureless. There are no eyes, no mouth, no nose, and no ears, and yet somehow I know that this thing is looking at me. It had no body, just a featureless head attached to long, lanky legs, and must have been no taller than 4 feet. It slowly turned its face back to the direction in which it was traveling, as far as I could tell, and began its uncanny gait back into the darkness. I sat there, shaking and mumbling as I tried to console myself. I had no explanation for what I had just seen. Just as quickly as it arrived, the ghostly darkness that had surrounded everything vanished, and the breeze returned to the trees. There they were, my friends, between the trees. I ran towards them and they were shocked to see my expression. "What the heck is wrong?" Terrence shouted as I reached them. It seemed that they had heard something moving towards the edge of the lake and gone to investigate, thinking it was me. It seems they too couldn't find their way back to camp and also found themselves trapped on some endless path to nowhere. I mentioned the sound, but they hadn't heard anything and had no idea how the fire had been extinguished, as it was strongly burning when they left. I told them about what I had just experienced, and Alex's facial expression turned to one of terror. He told me about the Native Americans in the area, having described seeing such creatures for generations, and that they often carried with them some sense of dread. We headed to the camp and noticed that all of our watches had stopped running, and so we had no idea of the time frame in which these events occurred. Needless to say, at this point we didn't sleep a wink that night, but the rest of it was uneventful. We left hastily at dawn. For years I had wondered what these creatures were and why this one felt the need to show up at our camp. All I had was this tale of Native American legend and the fear that stayed with me since that night. It seems now that there is video evidence of these creatures venturing outside of the forest and into built-up areas. I can't help but wonder what is drawing them closer to humankind, and just what it is that they may be planning. In the meantime, we will never know. It was another normal night. I spent a few hours on my computer, played on my Xbox, and made food. The usual. But it wasn't until later that night that I experienced the most phenomenal thing. I was getting ready for bed. I slipped into my pajamas and tucked myself in. I laid there, resting. Thousands of things floating through my mind. All of my thoughts from the day before came back. All the weird sounds I had been hearing in my head. The static. I was thrown out of the bank the other day for setting off the metal detector, even though I had no metal on me. Or so I thought. I finally began sleeping, my eyes tight shut and my brain on standby, until a bright white light lit up my room. I slowly opened my eyes, trying to focus on the light reflecting through my window. I had no energy to get up and check. I heard creaks. The next thing I knew, I was naked, tightly strapped to a very uncomfortable metal bed of some sort. I couldn't move. Two shadows laid before me. My eyes couldn't focus on the bright light that shone down on my face. I couldn't speak. My voice was gone. I tried screaming, shouting, but nothing came out. I felt a small needle pierce through my skin of my arm. Something was injected. I tried to escape, but whatever it was restraining me held me down tightly with all its might. The light turned down and I could finally open my eyes. In front of me were the ugliest creatures I'd ever seen. They were green and slimy with massive black eyes beating down on me. They had large heads. There were 3 of them. Behind them was a window. I could see clouds. I saw 4 fingers come towards my face. 2 were placed on my eyes. They were gently shut. I woke up again. Only this time I was back in my room. Was it all a dream? Was I really abducted by aliens? No, of course not. Aliens aren't real. I hopped out of my bed still woozy from the dream. I fell flat on my face with agony. I couldn't walk. I looked at my foot. It was all bruised. Along the soles of my feet were purple and blue bruises. It wasn't until I noticed the red mark on my arm, the same place where the needle was inserted in my dream. It hit me like a ton of bricks. It wasn't a dream. It happened. I was abducted. My one memory of that fateful day. "Where should we play? The park?" asked Ben. Ben was my cousin and my sister Olivia was also with us. She loved playing with dolls, especially her new collection of Dream Mermaid dolls. Of course, this wasn't suitable for all of us, so we all had to meet each other halfway. So we all decided to go to the park. There was a park in walking distance, which had some play equipment and whatnot, as well as a soccer field. Of course, as well as playing on the regular equipment, swings, slides, rock climbing, etc. We also played tag nearby. It was actually quite fun. I could tell from Olivia's smile and Ben's giggling that we were all sharing the happy feeling. Not far from where we were playing, there was a small area with some dirt trails for hikers and joggers to walk or run, and thick trees and foliage which you could describe as a mini forest on either side of them. Of course, Ben and Olivia and I had no intention on going in, seeing as there was nothing to play with in there, as well as all the numerous reportings of the foxes. We all decided to play soccer on the field that was adjacent to the playground with all the equipment. We spent about 2 hours having fun playing soccer and had many games that were 2-on-1. I'm happy to say that we all got our fair share of wins and losses, and we all had a great time. But it took one of Ben's double whopper kicks to send the ball hurtling through the air and through the trees of the forest. Unfortunately, due to the forest's hilly geography, the ball rolled down and disappeared into the trees. Of course, this meant that I had to go fetch the ball, but despite my feelings, I bravely ventured in. Ben and Olivia trailed along for the fun, but there was something about these woods that unsettled me. It was just the fact that the forest was dead quiet, despite there being so many people nearby, The contrast between the forest and the playground and the soccer field was uncanny. Not before long, the sight of the jogging trails disappeared through the trees, and I began to get a little uncomfortable. Maybe it was the way the trees were twisting in odd, distorted patterns. Olivia began hugging my leg with fear, and Ben's face got the unmistakable look of being uncomfortable. And he also huddled up close to me for comfort. We had sighted the ball, and I quickly ran over to retrieve it. It was in the small ditch, but I managed to get it out with little effort. Ben and Olivia had already begun walking back, and I immediately followed along to make sure that they stayed out of trouble. But it wasn't until about 3 minutes later that I had realized that they'd been walking the wrong way. Approaching the ditch and retrieving the ball made me lose my sense of direction. I began pointing them in the right direction, but then Olivia said in her small voice,
"Josh, I think I saw someone."
I could tell from her voice that she was scared, and I just sighed lovingly. I told her that people often come through here for hiking, but Olivia said that he had a white face and a red nose, much like a clown. Then randomly, Ben screamed at an ear-piercing volume, and I was beginning to get worried. Naturally, I decided that we would be leaving immediately. As we began to walk out, a man dressed in a clown mask with striking red hair emerged from behind a tree. He had a cheap-looking black jacket on, accompanied with some tacky pants, as well as some pale gloves. At this moment, we were paralyzed with fear, but when I snapped out of it, I snapped a photo of him for evidence, which is shown above. We didn't even need to tell each other to run. Our legs just made the moves for us. We all sprinted like we were in the Olympics. I felt hopeless that we were in such a secluded area. After a couple of minutes, the bounding of feet behind us had stopped. We turned around and we were greeted by a relieving absence of the clown. Olivia was crying at this point, and Ben had just this look of worry on his face. After I had calmed them both down, I told them that we should slowly sneak through the trees, and that all three of us should keep an eye out, and so we did. But about halfway back, we heard this hysterical laughter behind us, and the clown was chasing us again. We all resumed our frantic dash, and we finally reached the clearing. The clown had once again retreated back into the thick foliage. I told my dad the whole story and showed him the photo. We called the police, but by the time that they had gotten there, they said that they had not found a trace of the clown, except for one of his gloves that we'd seen him wear. But soon after, they made a terrifying discovery. Apparently, the clown abducted and killed children that wandered into the woods alone. He would then sneak out and steal some kids from the playground itself, before returning to the forest and killing them. The police had assumed this from the bones and corpses that they discovered. All the police had to say was that we were lucky not to become a part of the clown's collection of children.